Good. Right. Good morning. Good morning to members of the committee. Welcome to the Health Overview and Scrutiny Committee meeting today. We've got quite a packed agenda, and we're in quite difficult times. So we will move on and start working our way through it. Welcome to anybody who's watching via YouTube. Right. First of all, then we take apologies. I've got apologies noted from Councillor Helen Molyneux. I'm not aware of any substitute that's been appointed for her. Are there any other apologies?
No other apologies, Chairman.
Excellent, thank you. We'll now move on to declarations of interest. Does anybody wish to declare an interest? Well, I'll take silence as no, and we'll move on then to the minutes. We've got before us the minutes of the last meeting. I thought I'd just mention before we go to those that in the last meeting we had a public representation from Mr. Marco Taylor, and following that meeting on the 27th of November, Mr. Taylor did contact me questioning some of the accuracy of the information that was presented at the meeting. That has been discussed with the health bodies, and we will be coming back to that service in March for a further update on phlebotomy services, and we will take the concerns and the response to Mr. Taylor at that time, which he's very happy for us to bring forward at that date. So we are addressing the points raised, but not in this meeting. So in respect to the minutes, are we all happy that the minutes represent an accurate record of the meeting we held? Right, I'll take no response as an affirmative, and that we can proceed with agreeing those minutes then. Thank you. So the next item on the agenda is public representations. We don't have any public representations at this meeting. So we'll move on to item 5, which is an update from the South West Ambulance Service. And for that, we have Stephanie Bonza, who's the County Commander for the South West Ambulance Service, the NHS Foundation Trust, also supported by Mary Hutton and Dr. Andy Seymour from the CCG. And I'm not sure if Mark Walkingshaw is present or not, but he may well also be supporting this. So may I welcome Stephanie Bonza to the meeting, and I can ask you to present your report. Thank you.
Good morning, and good morning all. I believe Mary or Andy may be presenting performance, so I don't know whether we want that first or just my update in general. Entirely up to you.
I think we'll take your update in general, and then we'll go to Mary for some detail, unless they wish to do it differently, but I haven't been advised of anything else, so we'll go straight to you.
Yeah, that's absolutely fine. So I just thought I'd give you a bit of an overview of the last 12 months and focus slightly on obviously our COVID reaction and plan that has been in place. So activity in Gloucestershire has steadily been rising. During lockdown, we actually noticed a significant decrease in activity where the public were encouraged to stay at home and our activity was slightly down. Since June, activity levels have returned to normal with a significant increase with us for the beginning of December onwards. Our category 1 mean performance has remained fairly steady, at best 6.7 minutes in October, slightly rising as activity increases over the last few months. Category 2, 3 and 4 performance, which are our lower acuity calls, have significantly improved over the past few months. Over the last 12 months, around about 10% of our calls are triaged with advice at source and closed down before they reach an ambulance, and 38% of our calls are treated on scene by paramedics without the need to attend hospital. Around 46% of our patients are taken into accident and emergency. We have seen an increase in handover.
Just on a quick point of order, there's a lot of statistics coming at us very fast. Are we going to get a written version?
Yes, there is a written report that can be shared. I think the performance report in detail has. So I'm just taking some of the headlines for you.
Lovely, thank you.
Okay.
Sorry, Chair.
No problem at all. So we have seen an increase in handover delays, obviously with the pressure across the acute trust, and that's not just at Gloucester Royal, that's seen across the South West Ambulance Service footprint. We have put in a hospital ambulance liaison officer 7 days a week that assists the flow through accident and emergency, and I'm working with our commissioning and acute colleagues to ensure that the reduction in delays is seen and doesn't impact either patient safety or our crews. During the pandemic, we've worked with a number of volunteers and partner organisations, as well as our community responders. We've worked with Gloucester Fire and Rescue and provided staff to work with our paramedics on frontline ambulances after a training programme. We've also trained community first responders to work alongside our paramedics as emergency response assistants. The community response manager works with that CFR team to ensure that our schemes are in the right places. So where we have rural postcodes, we have our CFRs working with patients that have fallen without injury, and they're provided with lifting chairs and training to ensure that long waits don't occur. We've also had our CFR team working with our Make Ready team, who ensures that frontline vehicles are cleaned to highly rigorous infection prevention control guidelines. They are also supporting a welfare car at Gloucester Royal, which means that our crews are provided with refreshments, and also if they need to restock the ambulances at remote locations. Over the last year, we've continued to recruit paramedics and emergency care assistants, and we've also recruited this year successfully 4 ambulance nurses to work alongside our colleagues, which has been a huge success. As you probably know, we've also worked with Gloucester Rugby Club to teach CPR and basic life support so that the public know what to do in an emergency situation. As an immediate response to the COVID pandemic, we set up a county coordination centre at Staverton Ambulance Station, which provides 24/7 advice to our staff. They are guided on self-isolation. We have a swabbing service available to them. They complete lateral flow testing, which identifies if they were to have the virus to avoid people coming into work. They're supplied with full personal protective equipment, which includes an individually issued powered respirator hood. We also undertook a large cohort of asymptomatic swabbing for our staff during the year. Towards the end of the year, we vaccinated for influenza, and 84% of our staff were vaccinated. The others were offered but declined or had allergies. And we're currently working with Gloucester Hospital Trust to vaccinate SWAS frontline staff against COVID. To date, we've vaccinated 316 of our staff. That's an overview from me. Shall I let Mary present performance, and then happy to answer any questions?
Yes, thank you very much, Stephanie. Mary, if you'd like to come in and do your part, we'll then go to questions from everyone.
So I'm just going to highlight the performance that is shown in the performance pack today. So for November, we had category 1 average 8.2 minutes across Gloucestershire. We showed activity in November had a slight reduction of about 2.2% overall reduction compared to activity in 2019. We did see a small deterioration in performance in November, but we do expect to see December's performance to be more challenging when those figures are collated, because clearly we had significantly greater pressure in December, and you've already heard Stephanie mention some of the issues with handover delays. I think the performance then in the pack is shown the performance by area. And category 2 performance was slightly more challenged, with an average time of 22.4 minutes against the 18-minute target in November, but it has remained stable since December 2020. So I think I'm happy to take comments on that. It's in page 35 of the performance report. That's all I wanted to update on performance at this stage.
Could I just come in, Chair? I believe some members are using the chat facility to draw attention to sort of wishing to speak. unfortunately, because sort of I'm taking notes and Brian sort of chairing the meeting, if you can't get the chair's attention by raising hand on the computer, could you raise your hand physically, and that way Brian will be able to note whether you wish to speak. I hope that's okay, Chair.
Yes, thank you. I mean, I spotted Steve Lydon's notes, so we will come back to that at the end of this item. So on that basis, I think the first person who wants to speak on this item is Paul Hodgkinson.
Thanks very much. Happy New Year, everyone. Thanks for taking us through the ambulance stats for the last few months. And I'm looking at performance report, which goes back to April 2019. So we've got quite a long history of stats there, which is very useful. I think my concern is for the Cotswolds. I'm going to be parochial about this because I represent a large rural part of the Cotswolds. And over the years, I've raised and others have raised, repeatedly, the concern about how much longer the time is taking to get to critical situations and other patients in the Cotswolds. And obviously, if you look at the stats, even pre-pandemic, the Cotswolds were still up there around 11 minutes. It came up to 12 minutes earlier this year. And that is not just obviously to do with the pandemic. That is pre-pandemic and at times when the pandemic was less severe than it is now. Obviously now is a very serious situation, so I totally accept that. But my concern is that this situation has never really changed. We've kept raising it, that the target's not being met in the Cotswolds, yet it doesn't really change. And I want to really understand what the plan is going ahead, please, so that we can see those numbers coming down and that residents in the Cotswolds can be much more reassured that they're getting the same kind of level of service that you're seeing in, for instance, Cheltenham and Gloucester, whose stats are so much better than the rural areas. Thank you.
Yeah, happy to take that. So I do appreciate your concerns, and as you know, with the Cotswolds being a significantly rural area, it remains a challenge for us, so that is acknowledged. We are working with our staff around rota planning, with our estates team around projecting where these calls come from, and as you know, as you say, the Cotswolds has been an issue for a little while for us. It's worth saying that with our CFRs, we're constantly again looking to ensure we have somebody in the rural areas to initially be with patients until we can get there. I think one of the challenges is, of course, Gloucester and Cheltenham as urban areas will potentially have a significantly higher performance simply because of their location, where ambulances will turn around at Gloucester Royal and then be available for calls in the more urban area. There are a number of things that we can also look at, and that's working with our fire responding teams equally. And we are, just to sort of reassure you, looking at within the next 12 months and then ongoing to increase our cover in each of those areas. Also, from a patient safety point of view, just to reassure you that every call that we do miss, we rigorously review to ensure that harm hasn't come to patients. And of course, that's one of the most important things to ensure. So I do acknowledge your concerns and appreciate those, but just to sort of assure you, we do work with a company called ORH that model our activity and like you say, where we aren't achieving what we would like to in the more rural areas.
Thank you for that response. I think the next person who'd like to ask a question is Dilys Neal.
Yes, I've got a few questions. So I'm with Paul. I'm from the North Cotswolds, and I was the former GP there as well. So I used to know the paramedics and the problems that they had. So, a couple of things. So. You've given us the averages, but sometimes there's sort of wild outliers that increase the averages. Does that happen in the Cotswolds? I mean, if you have a call that takes sort of 30 minutes to answer, and then most of the rest take 9 minutes to answer, that would affect the averages. So sometimes just the bald average doesn't actually give you an accurate picture of what's going on. So that's my first sort of comment. also maybe not now, but maybe at another time, it would be really quite helpful for us to know the relationship between community first responders and paramedics. If a community first responder arrives within 6 minutes and then the ambulance doesn't arrive for another 10 minutes, is that a reasonable thing? I'm not quite sure whether it is or not. And the other thing that I'm interested in is you've said that 316 of your crews have had the first vaccination, and I just wondered what percentage that represents. Are the paramedics being accounted as frontline workers? Because we've seen some bad press about that on the television. Thank you very much.
I'll try and remember all of those questions and come back to you with answers.
Sorry.
Yeah, you are right. Figures will tell you a number of things. So any sort of mean or average will start from the lowest response time to the highest response time. So as previously discussed, any of those outliers will be reviewed for any patient safety issue. So if we didn't get to a response within the agreed time and it was a longer wait, as we call them, yes, it would be reviewed. But you're right that the performance that we report against now nationally is a mean. So it will incorporate shorter response times than 7 minutes and longer. So yes. CFRs, yes, there's an excellent relationship. Kevin Dickens, our community responder manager, works up at Staverton. We have engagement sessions with paramedics and CFRs. It's, as you say, it's very important to continue that relationship. So we work hard to instill that relationship with both. And that's the same with the fire teams as well. With regards that was the middle question, wasn't it? So then the vaccinations, that is all of our frontline paramedics, our community first responders.
I'm afraid you've gone quiet.
I think you might have muted, Steph. We've just missed your last sort of minute of conversation. Are you able to unmute, Steph?
Right, we seem to have lost Stephanie for a short while. I think probably we need. Is she still on the meeting?
She's still on the meeting, but I think we've lost her connection. Shall we come back?
Yeah, so see if there's anything.
Can I just say something while we're waiting for her to come back?
Yeah, do so.
Yeah, no. So I just think I don't know about everybody else, but there's always going to be a difficulty in rural areas because of the distances involved, and I'm just wondering, the CFR thing has obviously been set up to partly ameliorate that, and I think it would be quite helpful to know how effective that is, and whether that is that's a reasonable provision, rather than expecting a paramedic team and an ambulance to come out. Is it a reasonable provision to say, well, the ambulance may not have arrived for 12 minutes, but at least there was a community first responder there within 8 minutes? Is that something that's reasonable? I wondered if maybe I would like to know a bit more about that, and I don't know about other people.
That might be something that Mary Hutton can perhaps comment on.
Yes, community first responders are built in as part of the response by SWAS, and there's quite a significant amount of training. Steph is just coming back on the call now, and she can respond to this, which is why we've included community first responders in the programme of vaccination, which Stephanie was just talking about. So we need to. We can actually produce some more information on how community first responders are aligned to SWAS services. You might recall about 5 years ago, we tried to put an extra ambulance into the Cotswolds, but it made such a negligible difference to the performance that we felt that we would need to put massive numbers of ambulances on the road to make a difference. So we can go back over that pilot. You had that pilot in your reports a number of years ago and share that with you. So I think we need to be innovative in how we think we resolve this, because it isn't just as simple as lots more ambulances on the road.
Thank you, Mary. Stephanie, I think you're back on the line now. We lost probably a few seconds of what you were saying. So if you are back on, do you wish to continue, or would you like Dilys to come back and refresh what was outstanding? I can't hear anymore from you. So
Brian, in the chat, she said she can't hear the discussion.
Right. Okay.
This happened to us on a WebEx call yesterday as well.
Yes, I mean, we do too often get situations where a person can or cannot either be heard or hear. The quickest fix quite often is to actually dial out and dial back in, because sometimes it just fixes itself. But
I'll try sending a message to Stephanie, Brian. Okay.
Okay. Other than that, I think we're probably going to have to struggle to continue this item. I know Stephen Hurst was also had a question. Stephen, do you want to give your question in case it's something that Mary Hatton can pick up?
Sure. I mean, I didn't realise it was 5 years ago since we started these discussions, but we have had discussions every single year for a number of years. And whilst we get warm in comfortable beds, actually very little appears to happen on the ground. So we face it the year after. Can we please have a timeline of when we are going to get improvements?
Thank you. Mary, do you want to pick that up?
Yeah, so I think we can talk through what is the art of the possible, but I do not believe we can have 10 ambulances sitting waiting on one call in the Cotswolds. That's not going to be the answer. So we've got to build on this community first responders. I would prefer to come back and talk to Stephanie and just explain how the community first responder works with the ambulance service. And we have said already that there is a process by which we look at all of the cases to ensure no harm is done. So therefore we have to accept that the geography of the Cotswolds is very difficult to cover, and we have to use different means than just straightforward additional ambulances on the road.
Yes, okay, I think that's noted. It's just the geography. I mean, this is an issue that affects the Forest of Dean as well. And sometimes it's just impractical to be able to get responders to every corner. But right, if Stephanie is not with us, which I don't think she is at the moment, I think
she may be dialing out and dialing back in. I hope that's the case. Martin Horwood, Chairman, I think maybe wish to speak.
Yes, okay, Martin, if you want to come in.
I'm not sure if others were ahead of the queue. I just thought, actually, Dilys asked a very important question, if we can even get it by chat text, which was what of the 316 frontline, or the 316 SWAT staff who've been vaccinated against COVID, what proportion of frontline staff that represents. And just in general, I just think it's very useful to have all these stats actually in front of us when we're talking to people who make presentations, and perhaps to have stats that compare like with like. So if we know the Cotswolds is a rural area compared to Cheltenham and Gloucester, but could we have relative performance stats, for instance, for Oxfordshire or Somerset and other comparable areas, so that people can judge whether or not we're getting a good performance or not. But I wonder if we could come back at another meeting with a written presentation.
Yes, thank you for that. We have some good questions coming here, but obviously to some extent without Stephanie being back online, we may well struggle to be able to answer them now. So
could I respond to the...
Yes, okay, Mary.
Just on that last point, we asked last time for some comparative information on performance, which we are pulling together. So we certainly can include the other comparisons around the rural areas for the ambulance service. And it will be very similar, Councillor Hallwood, to what we see in Gloucestershire. We know that for definite.
Right, so thank you. I think we've also got Nigel Robbins. You put a question in chat. Did you want to put the question?
Yes. We used to receive regular reports actually across the whole of the southwest, and I do recall that counties like Dorset, which probably have a very similar road structure to the Cotswolds in rurality. Sorry. They were conspicuously better than the Cotswolds, and I just wondered if, in preparing a plan to improve the Cotswolds ambulance category 1 and category 2 times, that Dorset has been looked at for good examples, because that's what you want, is an examples of good practice to help those areas that are relatively neglected, like the Cotswolds. Thanks.
Yes, thank you. Clearly, that will be helpful to be able to see what the comparative differences are there. I don't know maybe if you have any information on that, or whether it's something we can come back to by a written response later.
Happy to come back with a written response on that, and happy to pick that up and understand what other areas are showing.
Okay, right. Well, I think certainly all the questions will be noted. We're not going to be in a position to take a response from Stephanie if she's not no longer in the meeting. So we will pick up all those points and give a written response. Not an ideal situation, but obviously the best we can manage when we're not able to bring everybody to the meeting as we would like. So I think probably we must call a halt to this section and move on to the next item. If Stephanie can come back, we will come back to this item, but if not, we'll pick it up as a written responses. So in the meantime, let's move on to the next item on the agenda, which is item 6, Fit for the Future consultation output. There's not going to be an on-screen presentation, as the presentations have been circulated, but you will be able to, well, hopefully you would have already looked at them, but Becky Parish is going to be talking to that presentation, and then we'll take questions. Oh, but before I do that, I've forgotten, I need to go back to Steve Lydon. Steve, you had a point about the minutes, which we didn't manage to see if you were trying to contact us. What was your point?
One is an observation, Chair, about, and I think Joe and yourself have done magnificent in getting the papers together. But to be frank, I wasn't joking before the meeting. I spent hours this morning trying to go through the stuff, where I've got 3 different computers and a printer, and I still haven't managed to unfathom all the various things we've been sent. I know it's a strange time, but it would greatly help us all to actually get the benefit of these meetings, to actually get the stuff in advance. And the ambulance stuff is critical. So that's a plea. And the second one was, the next meeting is the last meeting of the year. I've talked to some members of the Adult Social Care Committee as well. I mean, how and when are we going to talk about the review of the form and function of this committee? Because certainly the COVID experience would suggest, and I know we've got a joint meeting with the Adult Social Care Committee, and a number of some raises at every meeting, but certainly I think it was a retrograde step to take out public health and adult social care from the role of this committee. But we seem to be dragging on, and can I ask that it gets on the agenda for next time?
Yeah, thank you for those points, Steve. On that second point, we do have a joint meeting with Adult Social Care coming up later this month, and that was set up specifically to allow members of HOSC who will be able to join the meeting to directly ask questions of the Director of Public Health at that meeting. So we put that in as an interim step, which will allow people, members of this committee, to question public health issues. And at that meeting, we will also have representatives from the CCG to make sure that we can pick up the whole picture. But the broader point you're making about should we be taking rearranging the way scrutiny operated, that review is going to take place, and I don't know, Joe, if you've got an update of when that's going to happen.
I have got an update. Just to clarify a couple of points, Steve. Right up to the wire, we are working with professional colleagues to try and get papers together. I think you can appreciate the huge pressures that they're under. They are under enormous pressures, and working with Becky and Mary and with Stephanie. But you know, it has been very difficult. So we do try every time to get the papers to you. I think the short turnaround with the Fit for the Future and the forested in consultations made it very, very challenging for them. But your points are noted. I have got an update. I've been working hard behind the scenes for the past week with my colleagues at GCC to get you an update on the Scrutin review. And I'm pleased to tell you that I believe next week you will all, that's county councillors, co-opted members, district councillors, partner organisations and professional colleagues will be sent an email with a number of questions to seek your feedback on the arrangements for scrutiny going forward and how you feel scrutiny should be sort of put into practice after the elections. So after the meeting, I'm hoping to send something out to you. So all points noted, and thank you for your patience.
Yeah,
thank you, Joe.
I'm going to just say none of what I said was implied as a criticism, but
I know.
Yeah, no. The point I'm trying to make is it isn't. Some of the papers are hard anyway, but I know you're doing. Yeah.
Yeah, and we completely appreciate that, and we do appreciate your patience.
Yeah, thank you for making the point, Stephen. And I think everybody recognises that it's quite a task to actually digest all the papers and then be able to bring forward concise and constructive questions which allow things to be pulled out in the right way. So we recognise that for the committee members, this is quite challenging, just as much as it is for the officers who are bringing reports to us and have very little time in this current crisis to be able to spend on that. And also, of course, we do want to have information which is up to date. So we want them to give us the latest information in a fast changing environment. So yes, okay, we'll take those points on board. So we'll go back there then to the Fit for the Future consultation output, and I will ask Becky Parish to introduce this.
Thank you very much, Brian. I hope you can hear me. Yes, I think you can. Excellent. Yes, thank you very much, members. And as Steve said, Happy New Year. We have circulated a presentation to you. We've also published quite a lot of material online. My understanding today is that you don't want me to go through the presentation, so that's a mercy for you. But I am joined by several colleagues here who will be able to answer questions about the Fit for the Future consultation. So I have with me here Ellen Rule is on the call, Simon Lansley, Mary Hutton, Andy Seymour, Deb Lee, and others who have been involved in this very comprehensive consultation that completed just before Christmas. We have turned around an interim output of consultation report very quickly for you. This report forms part of the evidence that will be presented to the independently facilitated citizens jury, which is taking place in the next couple of weeks. And indeed, this report plus the findings from the jury will be part of the data that is considered by the decision makers at the Hospitals Trust and ultimately the Clinical Commissioning Group governing body in March. So I'm happy to take questions rather than try and pick out areas that you might be interested in. So I'll be quiet for a little while and wait for questions.
Thank you for that. I've got, I think, Martin Horwood. I'll just check. Steve, your hand was up before, so if you put that up, because it was up first. Have you put it up for this item, or is that just still there? Right, with no answer, I will go to Martin Horwood anyway. Martin, we have your question.
Thanks very much, Chair. And I would just like to just reiterate the comment that Stephen made actually about the timeliness of papers, because in this case we had a 155-page report published yesterday. So I can ask whether it's really appropriate for us to try and exercise scrutiny on something at such a major issue with such a big report at such short notice. But maybe there's no way around that. But specific questions. First of all, in the consultation papers that went out and on the material that was out for public consultation, one of the justifications for the proposals was the success of the trauma and orthopedic pilot. I've seen a staff survey, it dates from 2019, which said that 38% of the staff surveyed thought trauma operating lists were running worse or much worse than before, compared to 11.5% who thought they were running better. 46% thought the quality of inpatient trauma care was worse or much worse, and only 19% thought it was better. And 46% thought fracture clinics were running worse or much worse, and not one respondent thought they'd improved. So first of all, I'd ask, has this survey been repeated or updated to give a more recent picture, perhaps from last year? But the obvious question is, was the picture that was presented in the consultation of this wonderfully successful pilot actually true? Was it accurate? A couple of other questions. One is, there's quite a lot of statistics about response, but I wondered if we could see the full disaggregated response data set. So, for instance, we know that 66% of non-health professionals who replied yes to the idea of an acute centre of excellence at Gloucester, but we don't know what the split is between those who strongly supported it and those who were kind of more lukewarm about it, and we don't know how many opposed it, and we don't know how many of those were from Cheltenham. So it would be quite nice to have a broken down data set rather than just the presentational sort of headlines, so that we, this is the Scrutiny Committee and we ought to be able to interrogate this data. Secondly, on page 18 of the full report, it says that online consultations, this is according to the NHS executive feedback, said that online consultations were most successful when accompanied, quote, by offline methods such as telephone structured interviews. And I just wondered how many telephone structured interviews were actually conducted and how many of those telephone responses were obtained. Because there are slightly contradictory stats in the report, and I'm just obviously not so expert as to know which was which. Next question, on page 20 of the consultation report, it says that views were sought out from groups most likely to be affected, including elderly people at risk of falls and people in low-income areas, which are two of the groups that I highlighted in my submission. So can we know how many responses were received in these categories from people in Cheltenham and other districts? And how did the responses to the questions break down from those groups? And then I would just make the final point, and we know that the NHS is under stress, extreme stress at the moment, and I think it's worth saying, as always, thank you to all the frontline staff and all the people who are involved, including thank you to management as well for the stress they must be under. But we did suggest that this was all, the Fit for the Future process was postponed until after the pandemic, and it is the Trust that has insisted on proceeding with it during the middle of the pandemic. And I just wonder, even now, if the extreme stress that the NHS is under, and the fact that lessons learnt from the pandemic are almost certainly to include lessons about service redesign, whether or not we should now pause this process and allow management to focus 110% on the pandemic response and not on consultation and reorganisation. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you for the question. I see in the chat, as we were saying, that Becky Parish has struggled to be able to hear some of that. So we seem to have a repeat of the gremlin that's working in the WebEx system today. I think Ellen Rule may well be able to pick that up, and if not, possibly Caroline Smith may be able to pick up the detail of your questions. And perhaps we could just check to see whether Becky's able to get back into the meeting in a full way. So, Ellen or Caroline, would you like to come in?
Yeah, thanks, Brian. I'll start. It does seem to be, there does seem to be some sort of gremlin because I was coming in and out a bit for you. So I'm going to leave my video off and I hope you can hear me okay.
Yep.
So there was a lot of, great, fab. There was a lot of detail in Martin's questions. I suspect some of them we might need to prepare written answers on some of the breakdown, because we obviously absolutely do have the breakdown of the kind of agree, strongly agree, where people came from, although probably not. I think it's probably likely, I think part of your question, and there was a lot in your question, is about exact locations of where staff work, whether they were Cheltenham staff or Gloucester staff. I think you asked that. You didn't ask that. Okay, I lost you a bit when you came in and out about the people who were based in Cheltenham. So I suspect the best way we're going to handle that is that we have got minutes. We've taken down as many points as we could, and I think we can respond in writing then to the whole committee, if that would be okay, for the detailed breakdown behind some of the questions that you asked, because we obviously have all of that data. So we can share that in a way that splits it out in the way you've asked for. That's not a problem at all. With regards to the Trauma and Orthopedic Survey, I would need to defer to one of my colleagues from GHFT to respond to that. I don't know if that's best Deborah or Simon. I can't quite see exactly who's on at the moment.
Deborah.
Yeah, I'm on the call, and right. I feel similarly blinded as Councillor Horwood described earlier, having not seen the survey or understand its origins. So very happy to look into that. I think what's important, because that sounds like it's a survey of kind of perception and belief, is that we actually look at the data that will give us very clear and objective measures against those things for the period, alongside some of the more subjective observations. So happy that we provide that either after the meeting or at a future meeting.
Thank you. I think Caroline, you also wanted to come in. Caroline Smith.
Yeah, it was really just on some of Martin's points around some of the statistics. So I appreciate you've had a lot of information, Martin, over the last 24 hours to try and digest. But online there are numerous appendices which do give many of the breakdowns that you've asked for. So perhaps if I could suggest that you have a look through some of those, and as Ellen suggested, then if you have some very specific questions, we can obviously look at the data. We do have all of that information there. The information on staff, however, will be broken down on the postcode that they've given us as to where they reside, and not from the dependent on the two hospitals and which hospital they may or may not work in, and obviously some of them may work across both sites too. So we haven't picked up that level of granularity. The postcode relates to their residency.
Thanks, Caroline.
Sorry, I think there seems to be a little bit of confusion. I didn't ask about staff postcodes at all.
Oh, sorry. Okay, we did hear that. That's what it sounded like.
Sorry, yeah, I know. Obviously, I did send these questions in writing just in advance of the meeting, but I'm afraid I have looked through the whole 155-page report last night. So they were, but thanks for the promise of more broken down data sets. That's
yeah. The appendices are online, Martin. There are lots of them, and what the information gives you is the full report by that appendix. So if it's looking at things like people who responded with a disability, it will give you the entire breakdown in the same way that you've got for the full.
Just the questions about telephone structured interviews accompanying online consultation.
Yes.
The high risk groups and how many responses were received from them. Is it possible to have an answer to those now or not?
So we haven't captured demographic information on the people who requested telephone conversations. Most of the people that we spoke to were asking us for additional information and for clarification, although there were a very small number. I can't remember the number off the top of my head, but it would be less than 10, I suspect, who actually asked us to complete the survey with them online. So we literally went through that and typed in the responses to it for them as they gave them over the telephone. Most people who requested a callback were asking us questions and asking for additional information and clarity from the booklet. But we do have, I'm sorry I don't have it to hand, but we do have the total number of those that were completed. But from memory, it was around about, I was dealing more with the forest ones, so I've got that number in my mind ingrained. But for Fit for the Future, I think it was around about 50 to 60 calls that were actually completed and made. And I will also say that a lot of information was sent out in the post and also via email as well.
Thank you, Caroline. Martin, do you wish to come back on those points?
Well, sorry, only the very last point, I suppose. Thank you for all the promise of, I'll try and find all those appendices and see if they've got all that. But thanks for the promise of more broken down data anyway, that's very helpful. Just on that very last point, whether really we should reflect now, given the extreme stress that the service is, whether this is really the right time to proceed with further citizens' juries and consultation and all the management that requires, and before we inevitably learn lessons about service redesign post-pandemic, and whether or not we should really look at pausing this whole process now until after the pandemic is behind us.
Well, we did actually.
I mean, I can start and I expect others.
Yeah, certainly. Okay.
Oh, sorry.
No, you can carry on.
No, I mean, I can start and I expect others will chip in. I mean, of course, it is difficult and everything is a challenge. But I think for all the reasons that we set out before, that hasn't changed for us in terms of perpetuating uncertainty. In the work we have invested already, if we were to stop, I feel we would get into issues of kind of relevance and then potentially needing to repeat work we've done. I think it feels, and pardon the expression, but in terms of the programme timeline, we're sort of on the home straight now in terms of getting to the point where we've invested so much over the last well, at least 3 years, I'd say. So it doesn't feel to us like this would be the right time to stop again and to perpetuate the uncertainty that we have for staff and to risk having to repeat work that we've done because time moves on. That said, our models, of course, one of the inherent challenges with any service change at any point in time is that you're trying to make point-in-time decisions about configuration of services against a continuously evolving pattern of service transformation that we have at all times in all our NHS services. And that's a dichotomy we have to manage, I guess. So we continue to have a learning approach to the experiences of COVID through the modelling and the work that we're doing around the implementation. But we don't believe, and we set this out, I believe, quite clearly before, that there is change and learning now that would affect the proposals we've put forward that we haven't already gleaned. And in fact, what we found was that the learning from some of the temporary changes, not all, but was that there were some lessons learned that actually reinforced some aspects of our case and confirmed our resolve to wish to proceed to get on and have certainty about some of the future service models. And not least, so the certainty does a number of things. So obviously, it ensures that we have clear proposals for staff about where they're going to be working. Temporary change is unsettling, we know that. But also, really importantly, for things like securing capital and being able to put forward business cases for investment in the estate in both our hospitals, which we can't do if we have uncertainty about how we wish to organise the services that are dependent on those significant capital investments. So our position hasn't changed, acknowledging the stress and pressure that puts us under. For all the other reasons, we believe that we do need to continue.
And then the very final point I would make, and as I say, others may wish to add thoughts, but in large part, there isn't an overlap between people who are involved in service delivery with the people who are engaged in work on business cases and consultation and engagement. So that's not completely exclusive, of course, but we believe that we can maintain
Sorry, I think we've been muted.
Something strange happening with the mute button.
Yeah, okay, you're back on now.
It's sort of, seems to be, well, it seems to be, I don't know if this is what other experience, but it seems to be clicking into mute on its own. Anyway, I hope you got that and you didn't lose me at some point. I don't know if any of my colleagues wish to add to what I said, but
I'll just add something. Yeah, it's Simon Lansley here. Morning, everyone. I think just to add to Alan, just worth remembering, this is a phased implementation as well. So this, whatever the final decision is made in March, the implementation period for this program is over the next 2 or 3 years, and we'd welcome your involvement in in designing that implementation approach. So this consultation is about getting those building blocks agreed. So what's going to be where, but then how we do that, and we'll continue to engage with you as a HOSC in terms of planning that.
Thank you. Right, you've had a couple of responses. I think I would also add my thoughts on this. Is that we did have the same question at the last meeting about whether it would be beneficial to delay it, and we didn't agree that it would be because we recognised the trust needed to get on with the task they were doing. And COVID, whilst we hope that there's a solution coming along in terms of a vaccine, there's no certainty that it's not going to be at least another year before things are back to normal. And my own view is that we need to support those trusts getting on with the job that they want to do. And the task that we have in front of us today, whilst more difficult because information is coming to us late, I think very much we're able to do. We've got the information. It's harder because we're working remotely, but I think that's our commitment we have to put in to make sure things can continue to happen. So I would not support going forward with a request for a delay. I think the points raised about that do need to be answered, and if they're not answered today, they can be picked up as written answers. But essentially, we need to be working to scrutinise, but not hold back changes. I got next person on here who wants to talk, I think, is Nigel Robbins. Is that right, Nigel?
No, it isn't actually.
Oh, right, just before. Then I also have Steve Lydon. I think your hand's come up again.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Well, Martin has said everything I wanted to say. There's no point repeating it. Well, what I would request is that at a future meeting, we do have related to Fit for the Future, some discussion or a plan of how we're going to adopt any post-COVID learning points. That should be good practice. And the other one I wanted to add in, if we are really talking about being radical, some of us have talked about this for a number of years. And when we talk about capital, surely it's not beyond the realms of expectation to put into any discussion in the future as well a need for a new hospital between Gloucester and Cheltenham. No disrespect to many of us, but we've touched on this quite a few times. And the whole realignment, a lot of our issues are caused by the fact we've got one hospital over 2 sites and split up. Now, it's not for today, I know, but I would certainly welcome a discussion in the future. As and if we're talking about capital, etc., that surely should be part of some future discussion. And I would have thought would have been good to put into the start of any Fit for the Future discussion. But it's not my document. So I'm supportive, but I do find it strange. But I mean, ultimately it's up to you guys. Thank you, Chair.
Okay. Thank you for that, Stephen. Interesting point that you just made, which we might need to hold for the next item, because there we do have 2 hospitals being put into one new one, which isn't causing everybody to be overjoyed about it. So I think there's I certainly recognise the point that one new purpose-built hospital would be attractive, but whether it's a good way of using resources at the present time. I've no idea, but I think we're probably constrained to the opportunity in front of us is the one hospital split over 2 sites. But Deborah Lee may wish to comment on that. I'm not sure. Deborah, do you have anything to add to that point?
I can add to that, and we're still waiting for further announcements. You may remember before Christmas there were announcements about 8 new significant new bills in the NHS through the National Capital source. We weren't one of those, and in fact it was not entirely clear how the bidding process had worked for those trusts that were awarded capital. I think it related to prior expressions of interest. So we've signalled our interest in understanding and being made aware of any future process that would allow us to bid. What we do know is that because of the process, both in terms of securing capital, the priority that would be afforded to Gloucestershire and the time it takes to mobilise and build a new hospital, that we're looking at the earliest something that's out 15 to 20 years, and therefore these changes for us remain valid and appropriate, because this is about change to service configuration that takes account of our current estate and the estate that we were living with for, as I've said, well over a decade.
Okay, thank you, Deborah. Clearly, we have desires for a new hospital. I've seen coming in on chat as well, so we won't forget that. But for the meantime, we need to work on how we can best configure what we've got. Right, I don't think I've got anybody else who are looking to ask questions on this point, on this item. So, but I also believe Becky can now hear us. So does that mean you can speak? Do you want to come back in at all, Becky?
Yes, thank you very much. I hope you can hear me.
Yes,
as well as the WebEx not working, we just had a power cut as well. So I've heard some of the discussion, so sincere apologies. I can see from the chat that we've offered to provide information to questions. More than happy to do that. There are very comprehensive online appendices, but we can add to those as well, so we can look at the data in different ways. So as ever, always happy to provide information to Scrutiny colleagues. And I just wanted to finish, if we have reached the end, I felt like you probably had from the last bit of the conversation I heard. I just want to thank everybody who participated in this consultation. It was unusual. We managed to do a socially distanced consultation. We had a good response from people, and I'm very grateful to people for taking the trouble, and also to my colleagues for trying out all sorts of different ways of enabling people to get involved, from online to face-to-face activities. And I'm confident that some of the connections we've made through this consultation, we will carry forward into 2021 and beyond and build on those. Really quite excited about some of the people that we got to talk to this time, because it was different people who enjoyed the different ways that we used to get them to participate. So thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you, Becky. Yeah, clearly, I think what we've got, where we've arrived at then, is clearly the consultation has taken place. There's quite a lot of detail in there that we've had a job to take on board in a short time that we've had it. But I think generally speaking, where the questions are raised, we will get written answers to the points that have not been answered today. So I don't see any further any questions being raised by councillors. So I think we'll note the consultation output and move on to the next item.
Could I just suggest, Chair, that if anybody has any questions at all, if they want to email them to myself, joe.moore@Gloucestershire, then I will forward them on to Becky and colleagues. So any questions, please email, and I will make sure they're forwarded to the NHS colleagues and partners. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe, and thank you to Becky Parish and the support that she had to deliver that item as well as we could. So right, let's move on then to the next item on here, which is the item 7, the New Forest of Dean Community Hospital consultation output. And I think for that one, we're going to go to Caroline Smith from the NHS Clinical Commissioning Group to present. Again, I don't think you're going to be using a presentation online. We've had the presentation presented already, so happy for you to talk to it, and members should have their own copy of the presentation to refer to as they need to.
Absolutely, thank you, Brian. Yeah, so I, like Becky, I'm not going to go through the presentation in any detail. But really just wanted to start where Becky finished, by thanking everybody who responded to the consultation. We feel that we had a good response to the consultation, and lots of engagement across the community from lots of people who perhaps wouldn't have contacted us previously, and so a variety of different ways in which we delivered the consultation, which we will continue to use, I'm sure, in the future, in addition to some of the more traditional methods that we would apply, pandemic allowing. The presentation is obviously now supported by the report that was published yesterday, along with, again, numerous appendices. There is a lot of information within that. I think it's fair to say, just as a general point, that there is quite a lot of variation in the responses that we received to the consultation, and many people still reflected back on previous consultation that we had held regarding the move, as you said, Brian, from 2 hospitals to 1, and also wanting to revisit the location. We were quite clear that those decisions had been made, and we were trying to move the conversation on. So we were pleased that we did get some feedback around the specifics of the service model. But again, a lot of the feedback that you'll see when you look through the detailed appendices does hark back to some of those earlier conversations that we've been having, I think, on the Forest of Dean since 2015. The report does include an overview and a breakdown of the responses, recognising the geographical variation in responses. And I would just say in summary that the other demographics that we have analysed don't show that same level of variation. So they're not focused on during the report, but again, you can review the appendices to see more information on those. That's all I really wanted to point out from the presentation. I am joined by colleagues from both the CCG and Gloucestershire Health and Care, who will be able to pick up any particular questions around the services. And as we move forward, we are on a slightly different timescale to the Fit for the Future programme, in that we've had our citizens jury in the Forest of Dean, and we have no more plans for that. So the next steps will be obviously the consideration of the feedback by both organisations, with a decision on the commissioning plan being made at our January governing body at the CCG, to enable further work to be done around the full business case for the new hospital by Gloucestershire Health and Care, which I understand they'll be taking to their board for hopefully to be approved in March 2021.
Thank you, Caroline. I don't have other people looking to ask questions at the moment, but as the that's we've also got Terry Hale here in a minute. One of the this is that you've got quite a strong variation. I think you've referred to it, that there is some support, but also people disagree with the proposals. So how do you believe that allows you to move forward with such a broad based variation in responses?
Can I answer that, Brian?
Yes.
Ellen?
Yeah.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we can.
So yeah, I mean, we are still obviously digesting the feedback, and we will be putting together a response to the consultation. I think Caroline has picked up a significant and important point, which is that this consultation response, we should perhaps not be surprised by it, because it is highly reflective of the response we had to the last phase of consultation. So at the difficult point where we moved through the decision to go from 2 hospitals to 1, if you can remember back, because it was quite a while ago now, there was quite a it was almost 50-50 actually, in terms of support, not support, which, as the point was made quite strongly at the time, in the balance of not support. And we therefore had a significant issue in terms of thinking through what we did next. Now, of course, consultation isn't a referendum, it is an advisory. And we have carefully looked at all the qualitative information we received back in terms of planning the hospital. But we also have to take into account the other drivers for change. And again, it's quite a long time ago, so forgive me, some members may not have even been with us when we were back then looking through the drivers for change. But they are all still relevant, and in fact, if anything, are even more urgent than they were when we looked at this back in the beginning in 2015, which is we have two very ageing buildings, much loved, but very ageing buildings that are just not economic to maintain. We do need a new facility for the Forest of Dean. I mean, people have talked today quite a bit about the learning from COVID, and we've had significant learning again about how that sort of estate has not been amenable to delivering care in the current crisis that we've been experiencing, with a result that significant numbers of beds have been shut in the Forest hospitals since the beginning of COVID-19. Because they're just not up to it in terms of the distancing, the ability to be support IPC regulations and so on. So we need a new facility. That has always been challenging, going from 2 hospitals to 1. I mean, it's sort of in a microcosm of what we've just talked about, haven't we, with the thought of doing that at a county level. It's difficult and people feel the loss of their facilities. And this consultation has given us a very similar pattern and lots of comments, as Caroline has referred back to that original decision. So I think we've heard that, but we feel that on balance, the drivers for change mean we do need to continue. But what we can take from this is some important learning and nuancing about the nature of the makeup of the services in the hospital. And that's what we'll be looking at really carefully. So we have some engagement work planned following on from this consultation around the comments we've received on urgent care. We have some work we're doing to look at the model of care for beds, although we don't believe that number can change. And I can talk a bit more about that if needs be. But that may be something for the next phase when we do our response. And then actually, on balance, there is support for the model around outpatients and diagnostics. So if you break it down to the service level, there is support for those 2 areas for the proposals we put forward, and less support around urgent care and beds. But work, I believe, we have in hand to work those things through. So, so I feel we can move forward. We have taken the decision, the difficult decision, to go from 2 to 1 to build a fit for purpose new hospital for the Forest, which I still think is exciting and we'd love to get there. And it's just now about nuancing the detail of what we put in the hospital and working with the communities, particularly the south of the Forest, around access to that facility and other community-based facilities.
Yes, thank you. And I think in particular as well, one of the concerns from the south of the Forest is that they're looking for commitment to new urgent care facilities, which I believe in some of the consultation discussions we've had at the District Council, for example, have been told that there is progress. But are you in a position to sort of commit to that, or is there a reason why we can't?
So no, I'm not going to commit to that today, because we have said that we're going to do a piece of engagement work with the local community to scope the art of the possible. So it still has to meet the other benchmarks of being deliverable, affordable, meet sufficient quality standards and so on. But what we have committed to is absolute transparency in sharing all of that information. So we're looking at a deliberative workshop approach, which we're planning with the Consultation Institute. So they will chair it to give it a degree of independence, as we have done with the citizens' jury. So what we'll do is we'll share that information transparently in public about the art of the possible, work that through with the community. If it is possible, we can move ahead with something. If it is not possible, then we won't. And I think we've been quite clear about that in our conversations with local stakeholders. And I think you would also recognise our duty for stewardship of NHS resources, the ability to deliver something with having appropriate workforce and so on, that are also constraints on what we can and can't deliver. So we can't give a commitment to something that we haven't fully scoped, but we have committed to scoping that and working it through. We hoped to hold the workshop in January, but I think probably it'll be February, just because of logistics and the challenge of pulling it together. But the Consultation Institute are going to chair that for us, and we're working that through with them quickly now in the background to pull something together. Obviously, it goes without saying, I hope it will be a virtual workshop, and we've had a significant interest in taking part in that. I think, Caroline, you can confirm for me the actual number, but I think it was upwards towards nearly 100 people. Am I right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Significant interest. And as you would expect, a lot of those people are from the south of the forest, but actually some of them are from other parts of the forest area as well.
Thank you for those responses. Stephen Lydon, you've got your hand up again. Is that a leftover, or do you want to come back and ask a question on this one?
Chair, I wondered if I could comment when you've got a minute either. I can't put up my hand on this.
Who's that?
Paul Roberts.
Yeah, certainly, Paul. I'll just check with Steve if he has a question or not. Steve, do you have a question? If not, then I'll take it. I'll go to Paul. Paul, you want to comment on this?
I just want to reinforce Ellen's comments, really, just from the trust perspective. And I think the particular emphasis I would put is that I think the COVID pandemic that we've obviously been through for the last year has probably put an additional emphasis on not delaying and what we need to do here. I mean, both the existing hospitals have been extremely problematic to deliver safe care in during the COVID pandemic situation. As you know, we've had to keep the minor injuries and illness unit closed at the Dill because it's unsuitable for COVID safe working, and we've had to close beds in both hospitals at various times as well. And you know, my experience of visiting and talking to the staff there is that operating in those environments is really been extremely challenging. And you know, for me, if you like, the operational concern from the trust operating these hospitals is we must keep up our momentum. It's partly what's keeping some of our staff going, I think, in many respects. I think just the other point to make, and Ellen has already made this point, is we're obviously going to have that process that was described looking at services in the south. But this consultation was about services within the new hospital, and they don't have a material impact on services in the new hospital. So I think we need to get on with that, and in parallel have that conversation about services in the south. That's basically what Ellen said, but just to reinforce that from the trust perspective. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. I think that's probably right, that that in the south of Forest, residents are looking for reassurance that all of the jigsaw will be put together, and this particular consultation does actually focus on part of that from their perspective. Okay, I don't have anybody else looking to ask questions on that, so I will thank Caroline and Ellen and Paul for commenting, and we will move now to what time is it? 11:14. Yeah, we'll move into the item 8, which is the Clinical Commissioning Group's performance update. That's going to come from Mary Hutton and whoever's supporting her. I think the opportunity here we were looking for was perhaps that any information you can share on current situations we would welcome. We obviously have a separate meeting with adult care joint meeting, which will pick up public health. But if there are information that you're able to share with us, I think the committee will be pleased to hear it. Thank you. Over to Mary.
So I'll give my colleagues advance notice. Maybe if I could ask both Deborah and Paul to just do a brief update on where we are, and Andy for primary care, that would be really helpful on current position. But what I wanted just to start by saying that it is clear, and I think you'll have seen this from all of the information on infections, that infections are continuing to rise in the community. We have seen COVID numbers of admissions rising since the late October, and they continue to rise. And we now have significantly more COVID admissions in hospital than we had at the first peak. So our system has been under enormous pressure in the last month, and this is not a position that's different from the national position. There is enormous pressure on NHS services and very great concern that we haven't seen the height of the peak yet. What I do want to emphasise, though, is that a lot of work is happening, and throughout the report you'll see a number of references to the programmes of work that we have in place to both manage demand and to change our pathways to continue to make our systems work more effectively. So you'll see that on cancer pathways, we talk about straight to test for prostate cancer. We talk about more use of advice and guidance for dermatology. And I just wanted to note for our clinicians, thank you that people have, in spite of pressures, continued to work with new pathways and think about doing things more efficiently together to get the absolute best results for the population of Gloucestershire. So there is a page summary in the report which gives you the November position. I just want to go through that briefly. It's in A&E 4 hours. The national position is 84%. Gloucestershire comes out at 78.4%. Ambulance category 1, I've already mentioned, we're 7.3 minutes with we're 7.9 minutes with the national being 7.3 minutes. So on those two targets, we're less than the national average in November. Then for OTT, 18 weeks, we have October in the report, which we are better than the national average. For diagnostics, 6 weeks, again, we're better than national average. Cancer 2-week wait continued to really show good performance, as does cancer 62 days and dementia diagnosis. We've also given you in the report this time on page 25 the NHS oversight assessments for 1920. They pick out a basket of performance indicators and they measure them for our Gloucestershire population, and they were published on 25th of November. And overall, Gloucestershire is rated good based on the assessment of the indicators, and we give a sample of the indicators set out on page 25. So overall performance is now challenged in December and January because of the impact of COVID. So if I hand over to, maybe if I ask Deborah first to just do a brief update as to where we are today, and then Paul, and then Andy, and I'll come back at the end to answer any questions or to do any further summary.
Thank you, Mary. You don't need to be very far away from the media to appreciate the inordinate pressure and therefore challenges that the NHS is under, both nationally but also similarly so locally. In our hospitals this morning, we have 219 patients who are COVID positive. Just by way of comparator, that compares to 148 in the peak of the first wave, so 48% more patients. We have had been as high as 60% more patients at a peak in this wave than we are today. We don't believe that we have yet plateaued, or indeed that we're on a downward trajectory. Understanding as we do the lags between rises in community transmission, the impact on hospitalisations, and then subsequently on critical care admissions, we believe, let me put it that way, that we have probably got the worst yet to come, and that's very much the basis on which we're preparing ourselves as a hospitals trust. One of the challenges we're wrestling with as a system is that many of our patients are now requiring support to enable their discharge to a much higher level than was typical before the pandemic. And what I mean by that is to enable a discharge, they require a stay in one of our community hospitals that perhaps wouldn't have been previously necessary, or they require support to discharge them to their home. That's putting our colleagues in adult social care under considerable pressure too. And I want to be really clear that we couldn't be working better as a system, and that we have got movement through all of our hospitals and pathways. But what we have is demand considerably in excess of that which we've seen, and finite supply, because supply is constrained most typically by our workforce. So what that means as of this morning is that we have 127 patients in our two hospitals who are medically optimised, so they're ready to be discharged from hospital, but we can't affect that discharge yet. Given that we already have fewer beds than is usual, because we've had to reduce the number of beds in order to have the appropriate social distancing between our patients, that's putting us under inordinate pressure. And regrettably, we do have areas open for care that are not ideal. They're safe, but they're not ideal environments. And on occasions, therefore, privacy and dignity is compromised. Stress, never safety. So the sooner we can move through this next month and start to see a reduction, hopefully, in demand for hospital services, then the better. And then just a final word on my colleagues, because I've said here many a time what a privilege it is to lead my 8,500 colleagues, but never more was that the case. I really am in awe of the extent to which they keep digging even deeper and finding a way to go forward. When I walk around our hospitals, they feel safe, they feel calm. My colleagues look and feel in control, and that really is quite extraordinary. Not the picture we're seeing everywhere either. So choose testament to the way that partners in Gloucestershire, in and outside of hospitals, and the 30,000 staff that make up the NHS and care family is working. It really is phenomenal.
Thank you, Deborah. Mary, did you want to come back and bring in somebody else?
Well, I'd like if Paul would come in next, and then Andy, just to update on community services and primary care, please.
Okay, that's fine.
Thanks, Mary Grant. Yeah, so I'll start where Deborah finished, really. Our 5,500 staff in GHC, equally, I absolutely humbled by what they're doing every day. And let's just describe it. I think if you watch the media, most of what you see, understandably and not unreasonably, is the focus on the pressure in hospitals, on emergency care, on critical care. And that is extreme, as Deborah has described it, and being responded to magnificently. But there is a hidden pressure, which is on community staff and community services that our staff are encountering, and it really comes from three different things. So the first is one of our main jobs is to try and help with Deborah's trust to make sure that patients are able to move on from acute care into community or community hospital or community-based care at home or in normal place of residence. And at a time like this, that's become a particular pressure point. Our teams have responded really well to that. So we've had to get our lengths of stay down in community hospitals in order to make sure that we can get more people coming out of Gloucestershire hospitals, acute hospitals, into our community hospitals. We have doubled our support for Home First, the process of getting people home with temporary community support, often from reablement and rehab staff, and that we've achieved by redeploying people from other services. So we've got staff who are working in services they don't normally work in order to make that capacity work, to ensure that we're dealing with those patients. The second place that pressure comes from is obviously those patients that never touch a hospital but nevertheless are ill with COVID. And Andy will talk about this, no doubt, but between us, we're looking after a lot of patients, 200 plus, in the community who have COVID but are not hospitalised, and all of the usual COVID precautions we have to take, and the risks that our staff are having to take to look after those patients alongside primary care colleagues to keep them safe. And the third place that the pressure on our staff comes from is that with all the rest of the patients that we're dealing with, we've got to take all of the COVID secure arrangements, which slows everything down, makes it a lot harder, dealing with patients that are more isolated, with more complex demand in some of our mental health services, huge increases in demand in part of our mental health services, such as children and adolescent mental health services, as an example. Colleagues have risen to that challenge hugely, but that challenge, we're right in the peak of it now and expect to be there for another few weeks. We're obviously getting a lot of our staff vaccinated, which is really good news, and Deborah's Trust has led that programme, so that's great, and we will play our part in the vaccination programme too. Yeah, a lot of pressure, but I think a really strong response from our teams to the COVID situation.
Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. I'll come in now as Mary suggested. So in terms of primary care work and activity, just a repeat of what I've been saying before, primary care is open for business as usual, and activity has been what we'd expect for a normal time of this year, plus other things going on as well. So clearly there's a lot of pressure in primary care, reflecting part of the overall system pressure. And primary care not immune to staff sickness in terms of COVID as well. And we're certainly seeing that across our practices. And obviously from a practice perspective, that has probably a more greater impact because they're small units in the first place. In terms of workload, so there are two other things that are having a significant impact, and clearly they're both COVID related. So as Paul referenced, there's a lot of COVID patients being managed in the community, and primary care are, along with GDOC, which is the provider of primary care, are running something called a virtual COVID ward. So these are patients who have been COVID positive and are at risk of possibly being required having to go into hospital, and they are being remotely monitored with telehealth kit, and at early signs of deterioration, interventions can be made promptly, so therefore hopefully avoiding and reducing hospital attendance. So currently we have about 240, 250 patients in those COVID wards, virtual COVID wards, and I suspect if we go back to April time, March, April time, these patients probably would be in hospital as well. So that I'm not undermining and underestimating how much extra work is going on in hospital, but it would have been worse if we didn't have this virtual COVID ward. So that's a great credit to the system to providing that. And additionally, we have patients who are just COVID, but perhaps not as ill, but still need to be managed. And my practice, as you probably know, is a large practice, but last week, for instance, we had over 130 patients from our practice alone registering positive COVID. So a lot of patients in the community still needing support. And lastly, the other significant issue affecting the workforce and the workload is clearly primary care's involvement in the vaccination programme. And I suspect, Chair, we'll probably be coming back to that in due course, but just the point is that most practices are contributing staff to the community vaccination programme very successfully.
Thank you very much. Mary, does that complete your report? Shall we now go to questions?
Yes, thank you.
Yes, thank you. And thank you very much to everybody who contributed to that, which was a very enlightening update. Certainly I hadn't appreciated the number of being supported in the community care sector, which if you add on to those in hospital is a huge number. I think I would, before I go to questions, just like to pass on, I think the thanks from this committee to everybody in the care service who's working so hard at the moment. I think we do recognise that the extraordinary steps are being taken to protect the citizens of Gloucestershire. So I'll pass that on. But then going to questions. Yeah. Yes, thank you. The first one I'm going to go to is Martin Horwood.
Thanks, and yeah, I obviously echo that last sentiment. I think the courage and commitment being shown is exceptional, and I think we all wish you well for the difficult weeks ahead. I've got a few questions. One is just about vaccination, where actually anecdotal evidence that I'm getting from neighbours, from the community and so on, and other councillors is very positive, actually, that this is proceeding apparently very smoothly.
Martin, if I could interrupt, I think yes, on the next item, we are going to pick up on a vaccination update. So we'll probably leave vaccination in particular to item 10.
Fine, no problem. Okay. In that case, only two questions, you'll be pleased to know. Just one is almost a bit of a public health one, that there's a lot of media attention again focusing on what are actually relatively safe activities like travelling distances, modest distances to open spaces for exercise. But my impression is that social distancing is beginning to break down a bit in the more familiar and slightly higher risk environments like food supermarkets and shops and so on, where they seem to be busier than in the previous lockdown, and there seem to be people who have just stopped doing the social distancing in quite the way they should be. And I just wonder how we can try and reinforce that really critical keep your distance message in these potentially crowded environments. And I guess it goes for schools as well, where so we've got apparently many more pupils in school now than we did in the first lockdown from apparently key workers. And then the second question is one I raised at an earlier HOSC about long COVID clinics, where we have actually instituted, I understand, long COVID clinics for people, but only at that stage for people who had been hospitalised. And there is continuing evidence, and other trusts are holding clinics for people who have not been hospitalised, but are nevertheless suffering quite serious symptoms. And I just wondered, at the time we weren't doing that, but other trusts clearly are doing. So we're in a situation where we're not doing something that's apparently best practice. So those are my two questions.
Thank you, Martin.
I'm happy to respond on the communication issue, Martin. We have got a joint communication approach across Gloucestershire, and this is being led by Public Health. But we have actually, you probably noticed, stepped up communications explaining the need to continue to socially distance. So I think in spite of all of this work, our infection rates are rising. So we're equally concerned, and the message needs to continue to be reiterated that we're not out of the woods by any means yet. And of course, we're very concerned about the impact of those infection rates rising and that roll on into our care across the whole of our health and social care system. So it's something that we would absolutely support, and we would need to continue to get updates and work together with Public Health on that. In terms of the COVID virtual ward, I'm going to leave one of my colleagues to respond on that.
I've just noticed that Angela Potter's offered to comment on that.
Thank you, Andy. I was going to respond in terms of the long COVID clinics, which are slightly different to the virtual ward. So in Gloucestershire, we have started to pilot the long COVID clinics, and we're using a cycle of PDSA cycles to understand what the needs are of the patients at 3 months who are still suffering with COVID symptoms. Initially, the first couple of clinics were coming through patients who had been within the respiratory service at Gloucester hospitals, but we have now opened it out and are piling it with a small number of GP practices, particularly the Churchdown practice, in order to get the model right for us to roll it out across all of primary care. It is following the national directive that has been issued to us in terms of thinking about long COVID. So we are definitely following the national best practice, but also taking the learning and making sure that we understand what the demand and the needs are for this particular patient group.
That's very good news. Thank you.
Thank you. Right, I think that's answered both your questions. I would add that obviously on the 26th we have a joint meeting with Adult Social Care, and we will have Sarah Scott, who's also going to be able to give us an update on some of the points you raised there. The next person I think on the list is Paul Hodgkinson, I think. Is he?
In fact, Brian, in fact, it was about vaccinations I wanted to ask.
Oh, right, okay, so you're coming back. And then I've got Steve Lydon looking to ask a question. Steve, do you want to come in? I can't hear Steve. In the absence of anybody else wanting to ask a question, Steve's not able to. We will move on then to the next item, which is an update from Mary Hutton on the clinical clinical officer report, which I think will give an opportunity for an update on the vaccination rollout.
Okay, thank you, Chair. I think it's the ICS lead report next, which will cover vaccination under this. Could I just say, before I start this report, we have included in this our a brief update on our approach to the COVID response, and then the vaccination update. I'm going to ask Deborah and Andy, who'll pick up the vaccination issue in a moment. But I just want to acknowledge all of the support across our system to NHS and care partners. We've had really brilliant support from the voluntary sector and the community on the support to vulnerable people. We've also had a huge response to people to volunteer to support the vaccination hubs across the county, and we wouldn't be able to achieve this. Massive support also from the fire service across a whole range of initiatives. So that has been tremendous, just to see how people in Gloucestershire pull together when we absolutely have to. In the report, we have updated also on just smaller issues, such as continuing some work on health inequalities, and there is national monies available for some of these initiatives. It's quite difficult to continue with the proactive work alongside all of the work we're having to do to deal with the response. But where colleagues and partners can continue to work on that outside of taking significant management time, we're continuing with that work. We've mentioned clinical pathways in the report, and Andy's already mentioned some of the areas we're continuing to develop and change. In order to keep ahead of this and to manage our capacity, we're continuing to work. Before we get on to vaccinations, I wanted to mention the NHS-EI engagement, which has been launched on the future of ICSs and their ongoing development. The responses were due to that engagement on the 8th of January. It sets out a direction of travel which we would broadly support in terms of a focus on place work and continuing integration across our systems. Some key changes are set out and proposed for comment in that engagement. The future of CCGs, there are two options. One option is broadly continuing as in a similar way, but ICS would become a statutory organisation sitting alongside the CCG. The second option for CCGs is that CCGs no longer continue, and the statutory functions of CCGs are carried across into ICSs. And there also is then work set out around the approach to developing a whole lot of initiatives such as provider collaboratives, etc., in that engagement. So we have produced a response as an ICS, we've produced a response as a CCG, the local authority have produced a response, and we obviously are now waiting to understand some response as a result of that engagement. But we have committed in Gloucestershire across the whole system as a commitment that we want to continue with the shape and size of ICS we have at the moment, which is Gloucestershire based, continue to be co-terminus and work deeper and faster to develop that integrated and transformation work across our system. So that's the brief update in the report, and shall we get on then to vaccinations, Councillor Chair?
Who is going? Is that Deborah going in next?
Yes, Deborah here, and I'm sure Andy and I can do a double act, not least because the most significant proportion of our vaccination programme has been and continues and will be delivered by my colleagues in primary care, who have done a simply phenomenal job. Of course, vaccination, immunisation is the bread and butter of primary care. So I think some very astute decisions were made early on in Gloucestershire when we seek permission not to pursue a national model of a single mass vaccination centre, but to develop a hub and spoke model of vaccination localities across Gloucestershire. So we have 10 community-based vaccination hubs that are run by Andy and his colleagues in primary care, staffed by a variety of professionals in a variety of buildings, the fire station in Cheltenham, community hospitals, large GP practices, and it appears to be a model that is serving us really well. Alongside that, we've established a staff vaccination hub on the Gloucestershire Royal site in our Redwood Education Centre, where we are vaccinating staff from across the system, so that's health and care. As you know, the government has, in my view, quite rightly prioritised staff working in care homes and delivering social care into the community. So we have certainly majored on ensuring that there's easy access for that group. And more latterly, since the primary care networks came on board, Andy and his colleagues are also delivering vaccinations to colleagues who work in primary care, but also colleagues that work in care homes. So when they visit to vaccinate residents, if there are staff who are still unvaccinated and they've got vaccine supply, then they'll vaccinate them as well. So it feels like a really productive model. Just to give some very high level kind of context in terms of numbers, for Gloucestershire to meet the government's pledge of vaccinating the 4 highest risk groups by the middle of February, we need to vaccinate 129,000 people in Gloucestershire. And we're well on the way to doing that. We've vaccinated around 48,000, and we believe, subject to vaccine supply, that we will very easily achieve that 15th of February milestone. The reason that is so very important is that the data that I've seen that's been shared with me suggests that around 88% of those who died in the first wave of the pandemic fall within those 4 priority groups. So if we can vaccinate those that are 70 and over, those in care homes and others who are deemed to be at high risk, we can vaccinate them by the middle of February. We've got a real opportunity to change the course of this pandemic within a couple of weeks after that day. Of course, let's not forget the vaccine isn't effective immediately, but within 2 weeks, we'll be developing a really good degree of immunity within that most at-risk population. So I'm going to actually one other thing I will say, because I suspect it may be a question, but there has been much debate running about the change of tack in relation to the second dose of the vaccine. What I want to stress is that from a public health perspective, the science behind it is strong. It has the support of the 4 chief medical officers for the United Kingdom. And when you look at a whole raft of data that has been subsequently analysed to exclude the key conflator to the published data from Pfizer, which is that a proportion of patients were already harbouring and incubating the virus at the point of their vaccination, then we've got every reason to believe that the degree of protection afforded from the first vaccine is as high as 89%. The second vaccine is about longevity of effect, so it's about how long that immunity lasts for, but the first vaccination gives a very high degree of protection, we believe, and therefore the strategy of immunising twice as many people as we would otherwise be able to do if we were giving a second dose, for me and my colleagues that know much more than I do about this, makes absolute sense, and we're fully supportive of it. And last week we ceased as a system to offer the second vaccination. And I'll stop there. Andy, do you want to say a bit more about primary care?
Yes, thank you, Deborah. I'll just add a few points, again, possibly to preempt any questions. Just as a reminder that, as Deborah said, 10 PCN sites dotted around the county, but they went in waves of, in our county, waves 1, 2 and 3, depending on their readiness to kick off and get going. And again, pay testament to my colleagues around the county for getting things so ready so quickly, because they worked inordinately fast just before Christmas to get themselves in place. But the point is that has meant there's been a slightly different pace going of vaccination around the county, and that's why members might have had concerns from constituents saying, "I've heard of people around neighbours who've had a vaccination, and I'm not yet been vaccinated." I can assure you that everyone in all the cohorts will get vaccinated, and we're, as Deborah said, on track to get by mid-February all those over 70s, all the care home residents, and all the health and social care staff vaccinated. The highest priority, as Deborah said, is the care home residents, and our aim is that by the end of this week we will have had all care home residents vaccinated, which is, again, fantastic news. And again, not that it's a competition, but compared to the rest of the country, there are some PCN sites who are on waves 4, 5 and 6. As I said, our lowest rate wave was wave 3, so we are certainly rapidly progressing. And I think the other thing, again, just referencing Deborah's point about the second dose, absolutely no more second doses from the beginning of this week. But there were 1 or 2 sites where, due to logistical difficulties, some second doses were carried out last week. So you might again hear of that from colleagues and constituents. But absolutely clear that going forward, first dose is the priority. And the group over 80s, we've probably vaccinated about 2/3 of our over 80s. So again, tremendous progress. So happy to take any questions or comments.
Thank you for everybody's presentation there. I will go first to Paul Hodgkinson because he was going to ask a question about this in the last one. So, Paul.
Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, it's really good news, actually, and certainly after, there's so much bad news around. I think this is just really good to hear. And so my sort of question around that, some of you have answered some of the things I was going to ask, actually, but my question around that is how we can actually get these figures out more publicly, whether that can be done daily or weekly, I don't know. But I know nationally we're hearing the government is now pumping out that daily figure for the whole of the UK. Wouldn't it be great to have a Gloucestershire figure, either daily or weekly, whichever works, so that people across the county get to hear? And also that commitment about the 15th of February is really good too. So that is that point. And I suppose the other point around, you've said that everyone will get the call. But just a concern around those with extreme vulnerabilities or learning difficulties. And, again, with some difficulties in handling the phone, text messages and that sort of thing as to how they will get picked up. They won't fall through the net, in other words, and that the surgeries will follow through to make absolutely sure that everyone on the list gets picked up. So just those 2 points, please.
I'm happy to take the communication and media question. I couldn't agree more regarding the singing from the rooftops, just how positive and successful this has been. I'm sure it won't come as a surprise that when we are operating in a national alert level 4 as we are now, then the messaging is coordinated by the national team. So what I can share is that we've got a number of very positive communications, media statements and the like that are with the regional communications team awaiting sign off. Unfortunately, that is the model that always operates when we're in a high level of alert. So it's not for the lack of wanting to share some of this. And one of the reasons that we didn't put this into writing in a report for the committee today is because we're prevented from doing that by the need to seek approval, and we can't do that on a very contemporary basis at the moment. So I know that will be a disappointment, but what I would say, there are some very reasonable and rational issues that are underpinning the approach to media. And I won't say more than that. So I can see concerned faces, and I do appreciate the concern, but there is method under some of the approaches that we're taking, particularly in terms of ensuring we most appropriately manage what is a global supply chain, not just one for the UK.
And I'll pick up the comment about communication to patients. So I think, Councillor, you're referring particularly to the group called the clinically extremely vulnerable group, which are they're one of the first 4 cohorts. So we want to be vaccinating them by mid-Feb. Now, this is a group that are known to primary care. If you go back to phase 1 of COVID, we developed mechanisms to contact all these patients because they were being shielded, and we needed to make sure they had additional support in place. So we have all those contact details anyway, and we will ensure that they get contacted in the appropriate way. Many patients thus far have been phoned for appointments anyway, so I would anticipate that following. But just as a backstop as well, any people who do not have a vaccine will be picked up by the national booking system as well, who will be sending out contacts as well. But absolutely sure that all those clinically extremely vulnerable people will be contacted directly by surgeries.
Brian, could I just come back on what Deborah said? I'm just trying to understand it. I mean, obviously this is a public meeting today, so people will know that how many people have been vaccinated now in Gloucestershire, which is great. I don't quite understand what's going on really with the government saying we can't publish the figures or whatever. I don't really get that. Is there a reason, or perhaps you could explain? Thanks.
I'll have another go at it, but again, it relates to the national alert level. The higher the level of alert in the NHS, then I'd absolutely concur. The more important it is that messages are aligned, are accurate, are not in any way undermining, because we've got different narratives coming out of different systems and regions. So that applies generally. You may say it's not particularly relevant application to a good news story like this one, but of course it's very hard to have nuanced and different guidance for different sorts of communication. So currently, because we are in the penultimate highest level of alert, then we're operating under those arrangements. So it's not that we can't put this information into the public domain. As you say, there's lots of very good national communication going on, but we are required to send that to our regional comms team and to seek their approval, and we've done that, and we're still awaiting that approval. And Paul, there's nothing more that I can add beyond sharing your frustration that this isn't able to get out in a more contemporary way. We have got a stakeholder brief which goes out on a regular basis. I believe that went out yesterday. I haven't looked at this week's to understand how much information there is in there, but I will dig it out and I'll send it through to Jo so she can circulate it to members of this committee in case you haven't already received it. Thank you
for that. I mean, I think clearly with the meeting being public, what's been said today is public. I suggest my own thoughts as well is that some of the newspapers may well actually love to rush around and try and find a postcode lottery story out of vaccines, which probably isn't really a sensible story when everybody's doing their best to get them out as fast as they can. But clearly, it's not going to be.
It is, and this is a public meeting, and I've spoken in the full context that I'm on public record. But there's a difference, in my view, to me answering a question in a legitimate scrutiny committee versus me doing media releases or going to camera and other communications. So I think we should probably celebrate the transparency and openness within which we operate as a scrutiny committee, and just recognise the constraints that we operate outside of these sorts of settings. There are many colleagues who wouldn't be having this kind of conversation even in their scrutiny committees. So I'm delighted that we do work on this very open basis.
Good.
Yeah.
Thank you for that.
I say something, Pam.
Yes, go on, Pam.
Yeah, I just want to ask Deborah, and first of all, I mean, I echo what's been said today, and in this crisis, as I said to you, Chair, before, that we're lucky to have this meeting today, and we appreciate everyone who's turned up from the hospital. Deborah, have you do have your own press officer there, don't you?
Yes, I do have a head of communications and a team that works with press.
And could they not be fed anything in? You've got to go nationally before you can do locally. Am I right?
We've got to go regionally before we can go locally. That's right, Pam. Yeah.
Oh, I see. Because it is a shame, that all the good you're doing and keeping it stable. It will be nice when it's all done. I really appreciate all what you do, and God bless you all. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks, Pam. I'm going to go now to Stephen Hurst, who's been waiting to ask a question.
Thank you, Chair. I'm just wondering whether I really should ask my question, because it is a bit going backwards a bit. But I'll come to the front end. How do you manage the virtual COVID ward, please?
Okay,
and people stay at home.
Sorry, I'll take that. So, first of all, patients are enrolled into the virtual ward if they are deemed to be at high risk. So these are patients with identified COVID, and they're in the more vulnerable groups, such as age-related or chronic disease-related. So they're already at slightly higher risk, and they are contacted by the practice, then enrolled into the virtual ward. I should also say sometimes they're seen in the emergency department, who will then put them through that program as well. So 2 ways of entry. And then we have a GDOC, which is our GP provider organisation, will run this along with one of our IT technical companies who provide them with a bit of kit. So they get daily measurements of their oxygen saturation levels, which are a key marker of whether a patient is deteriorating or not. And so regular data is provided to the group, who will then, if there's a deterioration in symptoms and data collection, will contact the patient, and then the patient will have a conversation with the GP, who will then either examine or assess, and if necessary, patient will be admitted to hospital, but hopefully can be avoided.
Thank you for right.
Can I just about the 127 people who are ready to be discharged from hospital. Are they now COVID-free?
I can respond to that. There are a number of different bases on which we can which we classify and therefore can discharge our patients. So some are patients who, of course, have never had COVID, and that's relatively straightforward. There is a group. This is a group that can often be considered to be most confusing, which are those that are recovered from COVID. So they've had COVID, they're no longer testing positive or symptomatic and not believed to be infectious. So those patients who we might call our red patients, who still are potentially actively carrying the virus and therefore could transmit it. Yeah. And we have discharge options for all of those patients. So we try not to hold anybody in hospital unnecessarily. The most difficult group to place has been the red patient, particularly if they're not able to go to their own home, if they need to be placed in a care home. But we're working through with partners in adult social care and with the Care Quality Commission, who need to register any home that we designate as a safe and appropriate setting to take a COVID positive patient into. But we do have the means to discharge patients of all types if they're well enough to leave hospital.
Thank you.
Because they're holding beds for people who will be needing them for the worst is yet to come.
They are, although I wouldn't overemphasise the red patients, because we have large numbers of patients who have not had COVID waiting to be discharged. So I wouldn't want to mislead that is in any way a constraint. But yes, as a system, we're very, very focused on how do we enable more of these patients to leave hospital in the next week in particular, because we do think we'll see higher levels of admission in around 2 weeks' time. So yes, and we're also reliant upon government, and we're working nationally. You may remember some of the freedoms and relaxations that were introduced into some of the discharge practices in the first wave. I've been heard to say regularly we cleared our hospitals in a week in the first wave of the pandemic, but that was supported by a number of changes to guidance about how patients are assessed, about means testing, about continuing healthcare. It was a complex set of arrangements that were very quickly revised, and again, we're imploring government, and I believe that they're listening, to review whether we shouldn't make more of those changes this time around.
Thank you, Steve. Right, I'm going to move.
Okay, thank you, Deborah.
Thanks, Stephen. I'm going to move next to Martin Hallwood, who has a question.
Actually, Deborah's going to enjoy this because she's already answered both my questions. And I just want to say that actually the anecdotal experience of people getting vaccinations has been very positive from everything I've heard from other councillors and locally. So I'm glad the big statistics also support that. And also, actually, just on the point Deborah made about this strategy of getting the first vaccination out to as many people as possible, I think given the virulence of the new strain and the rise in cases, that has to be the right strategy, and I think we should strongly support it. I think it's borne out by the data, and it's very good. So it's kind of top marks, and no further questions from me.
Thank you, Martin. Right, we'll go to Nigel Robbins, who's got his hand up at the moment.
Thank you, Chair. Just a comment for Dr. Seymour. We mustn't underestimate the contribution that volunteer groups are making to smoothing the arrival of people at the treatment centres. Initially at Cirencester, there were queues outside in the freezing cold. When the volunteer organisations and community response groups got working, it suddenly transformed everything, and it means that the nurses are able to concentrate on the job, which they should be doing instead of looking after frail patients in this kind of weather. I have a question, a broad question for Deborah, and that is, do you anticipate any supply difficulties, apart from the obvious issues to do with refrigerators malfunctioning, in terms of the supply of the vaccines in this period up to the middle of February?
Regrettably, I'm as good as the information that you've probably heard the government put into the public domain. that what we have is the picture that Andy described, which was that we had a sort of, if I can use the word, quite a differential start to the vaccination programme. So some areas like Gloucestershire are very much further ahead than others. So over the next 10 days, I think there will be a levelling of the distribution so that everybody in population terms has the same degree of access. So we don't have parts of the country who are very well immunised in terms of coverage and other areas that haven't even begun. However, thereafter, and I think we're talking by the end of this month, then I think the supply chain will largely be levelled and flowing. So we are anticipating potentially less vaccine in the next 10 days than we could deliver into people's arms, as I keep hearing Matt Hancock likes to use that anatomy a lot, doesn't he? Than we could. We have the capacity to deliver 30,000 vaccinations a week across our different models. We don't believe that we'll have that amount of supply. As I said, that's not because there's a shortage nationally, it's because some areas are further behind than others and we want to level that playing field. But we are advised by the Secretary of State and by others that by the end of this month we should have a steady and adequate flow of the vaccine.
Thank you. I'm going to go next to Dilys Neal.
Yes, thank you very much. Are you experiencing many people who won't accept the vaccine amongst the frontline staff in particular? And if so, is there anything you can do to persuade them to have it, or do you just have to leave them to make their own choice? And I asked this in particular because my son works in a care setting in London, and he's reporting that in one of the sheltered accommodation units with which he works, that quite a lot of the staff are saying they won't have it. And he does report that those are particularly amongst the BAME community. So I wondered if there was any pressure or education that was being done for people who were refusing the vaccine, and particularly to the BAME community who may be more nervous about it.
I can comment just from a staff perspective. Andy has probably got much better insights in relation to what's going on in care homes and the community more generally. For us in the hospital hub, uptake has been exceptional. Very few people have declined it. There are a small number whose allergy profile has led them to conclude with us that they may be better waiting for the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine. So it's a slightly different mode of action that makes that a potentially safer choice for them. We have done a lot of targeted communication. It'll probably come as no surprise that we have a WhatsApp group for most protected characteristics in our organisation. So I'm on the disability WhatsApp group, the BAME WhatsApp group, and all of those colleagues are incredibly excited, grateful, thankful that the vaccine has arrived. So it's not something, Dilys, that I'm picking up in terms of hospital care, but Andy may know much more about the community and his own colleagues.
No, I've certainly not heard anything from community colleagues, but I do agree. Anecdotally, I've heard that nationally, but doesn't seem to be a local issue, and hopefully it won't be.
Thank you. Right, the next person I think on our list is probably Steve Lighton. Did you want to ask a question, Steve?
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I don't want to harp on too long, but this whole issue about sharing the vaccination information, I mean, I would suggest, Chair, that if you possibly could, you could write to our local MPs to actually get them to raise this, because this is a theme. Since the start of this whole process, we've had information kept nationally, we've had plans being done nationally, and we've had to argue all the way through this to start to actually cascade down to local areas to actually have a better say in what's going on. I understand that, Andy, the GPs do have the age, postcode, ethnicity and gender of the people you're seeing, but that formally is not allowed to be passed across to the Directors of Public Health, which I find farcical, to be frank, and I appreciate others have got to be far more polite in this. So I think that needs to be shared, because if we're to encourage people to actually come forward, and certainly coming from Stroud, there is a tradition of different approaches. You know, we've got anti-vaxxers here, 2 of whom were arrested on Saturday. It would help us immensely be able to get the local data out to say how well it's going. So I would emphasise that point. The other point would be feeding into the priority list. Of course, it's right and proper that the elderly people get done first, but I would put a plea in for nursery nurses, shop workers, our own refuse collectors go out every day to do stuff. And where I've asked this question before, where do they feature in the pecking order? Because I think we need to give them some assurances. And last but not least, the housebound. I understand as yet the housebound haven't been inoculated, and I'm wondering where they are in all this. So sorry to go on. I'm not having a go at you, Andy, but I think this is a farcical situation, and I want to ask our local MPs be contacted to raise this.
Shall I just respond to the latter point, the housebound? Absolutely agree that housebound are a very important group to be vaccinated, and the reason they haven't been first in the queue is due to the logistics of delivering the particular vaccination. So the first vaccine, the Pfizer one, due to its instability in transport, made it virtually impossible to take that out. So we out of the kind of vaccination sites. We couldn't do those. The Oxford vaccine that's now coming on stream and we're now starting to use will enable us to do that. So we've had people started to do that in parts of the county, and again, going back to our waves, different ways, we'll be rolling that out over the next few weeks. And we'll also be working with Paul's team as well, who will also be providing staff to assist with that programme as well.
If I can just come in on the point about prioritisation. So firstly, Councillor Lydon, we speak very regularly with our local MPs, all 6 of them, and they are championing the cause in relation to the groups who lie beneath the bottom 4. There are calls for teachers, and you know the long list of key workers that everybody would like to be vaccinated. But again, back to the public health underpinning of this unprecedented global campaign. This phase is about saving lives, not reducing transmission. So whilst protecting those individuals will reduce spread, it will enable them to get back to their workplaces. This is not the group who are dying, who have the worst outcomes. The 4 priority groups, as I said earlier, 88% of the people who died are in those 4 groups. So that's why the priorities are as they are. But there's a very live conversation in government that says that when we've got through this group, should we just come down the age groups, or should we start to be more nuanced around key workers? And I expect that latter point will be taken on board, particularly once we get through the 60 to 70-year-olds who do still have a relatively high risk profile compared to much younger people, but not as high as the over 80s and the housebound. So all very actively being discussed, but no decisions as yet.
Thank you for that. I don't have anybody else indicating to ask questions, so it remains for me to thank everybody for that update. I see in the chat MPs are already aware, and I'm sure very interested in the progress of the vaccination process, and so I'm sure
we'll... Brian.
Sorry, Stephen.
Colette is waving.
Oh, right, okay, I'll come to Colette. I didn't see a hand up, but I will come on to it. Colette, did you want to come in?
Yes, just to say, I think the police are the highest priority of all. They're out every day dealing with everything, and I think they should be the first key workers to be injected myself. Thank you.
Yeah, very good point, and one that hopefully will be taken into account. So, yeah, I think we've reached the end of that that item. Thank you very much for the update, and I'm sure we will get further progress on that as we get to our joint meeting in a couple of weeks' time. I think that leaves us one item on the agenda at the moment, which is an update from the Clinical Commissioning Group. We probably have covered some of that already, but maybe you want to cover the other points off. So I'll go to Mary Hutton to present what you wish to on that.
In fact, I have mentioned quite a number of issues. It's given you an update on quite a significant amount of work that's happening across the transformation programme and also across the individual organisations. So I think, and it also covers in more detail the engagement on the future of ICSs, which I've already mentioned. So I'm happy to just take comments or questions on that report. Thank you.
Okay, that's fine, Mary. I've got Martin Horwood's hand up. Unless he hasn't put it down from previous time, and Paul Hodgkinson. So I will go to Martin first and then to Paul.
Yes, thanks, Chair. First of all, can I just say to Mary, thank you, or congratulations on starting work on the Presby Road health centre in Cheltenham.
Oh, good.
I've just noticed that, and it's very, very good news, and a good use for that site actually, which is a bit of an eyesore at the moment. I've just got a question. It's not specifically mentioned in the report, but it's within your remit. It's the contract for patient transport. And I raised this early last year because there was a change in contract then to a new provider. And I've heard some concerns about this. So I just wondered if we could have, maybe it doesn't have to be at this meeting, but maybe in full at a future meeting, an update on how that contract has performed and what the current situation is in terms of the contract and the performance and the cost of non-emergency patient transport. Because I've heard about, at one stage, SWAST having to step in to support non-emergency patient transport, which seems to be a worrying situation, especially the pressure they're under at the moment. So I just wondered if you could comment on that.
Yeah, certainly. I do recall that used to be a regular topic at our HOSC meetings. We haven't talked about it for some time, so thank you, Martin. Actually, the current performance of our patient transport service is really good, actually, and it's been so responsive over the last number of weeks when we've had to move people at short notice, and also last week we had to enact significant numbers of discharge in order to manage our system. So we found them to be very responsive, but happy to pull together a summary and share that at the next meeting if that's helpful.
Yes, that'd be very helpful. And so who is the contract with right now?
I can't exactly recall the name of the company myself, but I'll just email you. It'll come back to me in a second.
Okay, thanks.
EZEC, Mary, for our transport.
EZEC, yes, that's right.
Thank you for that, and thank you, Mary, for giving us that latest update. I think we've now reached the end of our formal meeting. We've just got to work on to the work plan, and I'm just going to give a reminder to members of this committee that you're all invited to the Adult Care and Social and Community Scrutiny Committee, which is on the 26th of January, where you will be able to ask questions to Sarah Scott, the Director of Adult Care and Public Health. So I look forward to seeing you all there. And our next meeting is going to be on the 2nd of March. We've got the local community phlebotomy services on the agenda for that. Are there any other items that members wish to bring forward at this point that might need to go on future agendas?
Well, I think we've discussed about the future configuration of the committees. As well as the questionnaires, I think we ought to have a discussion at the committee.
Yes, that will be coming back at some stage. I'm not sure the format of that, but clearly it will need to go on there. So, Joe, do you want to just refresh us on what else we've got going at the moment?
I've received quite an in-depth update, but only yesterday. So I'm going to be sending something out to all of you by the end of the week. It'll be a questionnaire format. I believe that is then going to be shared and looked to how scrutiny will evolve going forward after the election. So I think that potentially if the committee are in agreement, then an item at the next meeting at the 2nd of March to review the work of the committee during the past sort of 4 years and make any recommendations going forward for the new committee to consider at their first meeting in June. So I'm happy with the chair permission and agreement of the committee that if you want to do an overall review of the work of this committee and any suggestions going forward, then I can add that to the work plan.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. I think we'll do that.
Hopefully,
yes, ma'am.
Hopefully, this pandemic might be reducing itself, and one never knows when the election might be, so we can't gear ourselves on May. We just don't know that. But there are a lot of issues I get asked is prescriptions, doctor's appointments, and consultations now keep being cancelled. And I'm with you all. The first thing is the COVID. So I don't know if there's anything we can do. And a lot of pharmacists seem to be running out of tablets all the time now. So could we have somebody talk on prescriptions? I don't know. Perhaps other councillors will find the same. Even the hospital probably find the same.
Okay, thank you, Pam.
Brexit.
Right. Okay, so I don't think I've got anybody else looking to speak at the moment. So I'm going to close the meeting there and look forward to seeing you all in a couple of weeks at the Adult Care Joint Scrutiny. So thank you very much for attending, and thank you to the officers who've come along and given reports today.
Yeah.
And we do send our best wishes from this committee to everybody in the health service who's working very hard at the moment. So thank you.